In the last day, US financial markets have received a shock from the release of the April 2021 CPI. Now, the Fed doesn't target the CPI, it targets the personal consumption deflator, and it targets a personal consumption deflator of around about 2%. And we've said before that that translates into a CPI of about 2.5%. So if the CPI is hitting 2.5%, then the Fed really doesn't have much to worry about. So what was the shock that moved markets, particularly the US bond market, in the last 24 hours and gave them a shock and an anticipation of higher inflation? What happened was that the year-on-year CPI came out in the US, not at 2% or 2.5%, but at 4.2% year-on-year, way higher than was anticipated. It compares, for example, to a year-on-year rate of inflation for the year to 2020 of only 1.4%. A shorter time ago as February, year-on-year inflation in the US was 1.7%. But here we have a dramatic acceleration to 4.2%. Why did it happen, and what did it mean? Well, when we look inside the numbers that are provided with the CPI by the US Department of Labor, we find that almost all of the surge in prices is because of various components in the energy sector, or the things that use energy. And they are caused by what the Federal Reserve calls base effects. Now, what are those base effects? Those base effects are caused by the shutdown of the US economy at the beginning of the pandemic a year ago. A year ago, when the US economy shut down, people stopped driving. They stopped driving to work. They stopped driving to the shops. And in addition to that, of course, if they didn't need to drive, they didn't need to buy two things. They didn't need to buy fuel, they didn't need to buy distillate, and as well as that, interestingly, they didn't need to buy used cars. So the result of that was the market for those items fell very, very sharply. We remember, in fact, that the futures price for oil briefly fell into negative territory this time last year. Well, if you're a year on from that, and that's the negative number is your base for oil prices and gasoline prices and distillate prices and natural gas that you're using to heat your house in the US, then a year from that, what will happen is those prices will go up very, very dramatically, and also things like used cars will go up in price very dramatically, and the cost, very interestingly, the cost of renting a car will go up very, very dramatically. And that's what seems to have happened in these numbers. So the year-on-year rate of growth of 4.2% is primarily because of increase, firstly in the energy sector, where prices went up by 25.1% over the last year. Fuel oil, where prices went up by 37.3% over the last year. Motor fuel, where prices went up by 48.9% over the last year. And motor vehicle gasoline, where prices went up by 49.6% over the last year. Fuel and natural gas for home heating went up by 12% over the last year, and used cars and trucks went up by 21% over the last year. So what we have as the US economy reopens, what we have is the things that we use to drive to work, which is to say motor vehicles and trucks, and the the fuel that we use to for those cars and trucks go up dramatically in price, and this generates a short-term surge in inflation. Is this a long-term problem in the US economy? Well, we think it isn't. And we can see this actually when we look at not the Dallas Federal Reserve, which we talked about last week as providing the trimmed mean for the personal consumption deflator, but this time the Cleveland Fed, which provides similar types of trimmed means and measures for the CPI. They say in their release today that year-on-year rate of growth of the CPI was in fact 4.2%. In their version of the trimmed mean, in which they take away the 8% of the fastest moving prices and the 8% of the lowest moving prices, that falls to 2.4%. But the more interesting measure is the median CPI, in which 50% moved higher than this price and 50% moved lower than this price. The average rate of change, year-on-year rate of change of the CPI in the US is 2.1%, which is still below the target that the Fed has to get to of about 2.5% if they're going to achieve their actual target for the personal consumption deflator, which is around about 2%. So in short, what we have is a short-term surge in basically energy and used car prices because a year ago, and pretty much a year ago from now, the price of those fell to very low or even negative numbers, which is the case for fuel oil. Now the US economy is opening up again and people are driving again, we have a surge in those prices, and that generates a short-term kick in inflation in the US. Is this going to be a problem from the Federal Reserve? Well, we think not. We think these numbers will come down towards a lower target than the Federal Reserve in fact wants, and the Fed will remain immovable in terms of the Fed funds rate, at least for the next couple of years. What will cause inflation, however, is rising wages. And the reason that that's what's important about inflation in the US economy is that 85% of the jobs in the US economy are in the services sector. They're not in manufacturing, they're in services. And the major component of services is wages. So it's wages which will eventually, wage inflation, which will eventually generate price inflation in the US. But that won't happen until unemployment is much lower than it currently is. We think unemployment in the US has to be 4% or lower to generate enough inflation for the Federal Reserve to increase the Fed funds rate. That's not going to happen this year, and it's not going to happen next year, but it will happen. But right now, the Fed doesn't need to respond in any way to an increase in petrol prices over the level of a year ago.